Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. In France, advisors to the new president, Francois Hollande, are saying he should use a new audit plan for this summer that might find new debts and deficits in the shadows of the economy as a rationale for not delivering all of his campaign promises, cutting back on spending, perhaps even freezing a certain amount of spending, and also revise his forecasts on growth for the economy. Based on those forecasts, a lot of his stimulus spending was hinged to or pegged to. Now joining us to talk about what the people of France might really expect from this new presidency is Gerard Dumenil. He's an economist and a former research director at CNR, and he's written several books. His latest book, he co-authored The Crisis of Neoliberalism. Thanks for joining us, Gerard.
Thanks.
So what do you make of this? I mean, Reuters, the advisors around the new president, they're already sending out signals to investors. Hey, don't worry, you don't really have to believe what we said in the election campaign. I mean, what do you make of this?
Well, I think the promises of Hollande were not very daring, okay? And like in any type of campaign of this type, we should not expect, that they will do everything they said during the campaign. Okay, so actually, the people around Holland and the Socialist Party, should not scare the markets, in my opinion. Okay, it's rather people who voted for him from a left viewpoint in France should be concerned, because I'm afraid this policy will not be really true left policy.
So, I guess people on the left kind of knew that, and in the first round, many of them voted for what was considered the more genuinely left candidate. Let me get his name properly, Mélenchon. I don't know if I may be butchering his name, but given that, can one expect something more from Hollande than they got from Sarkozy? And if so, what would be a litmus test for you that Hollande's actually at least doing something?
But you see, you need to distinguish between economic issue and other types of issues. Certainly, from the viewpoint of social issues in France now, Hollande is very different from Sarkozy and the policy that he will have, because, Sarkozy government was trying to cut all social expenses, and education, schools, for example, this was an important aspect of Hollande's program, which was to create new position within the French education system, because Sarkozy was cutting and cutting and cutting. And in this respect, and other respect of society, issue of societies, certainly the policy of Hollande will be very different from the policy of Sarkozy. Now, if you speak of the economy, it's a different issue. Socialist Party has always been in favor of globalization, neoliberal globalization, and we should not expect too much in this respect. And anyhow, what they can do is rather limited, actually.
Well, his campaign, at least, was that it's a time for growth, it's a time for stimulus spending, and austerity is not inevitable. And now we're hearing that they're sending out signals, they're already pulling back on some of the promises about spending, or they're creating public opinion for pulling back. What do you make of what can Hollande really do, and what within the limits of who they are?
When he was speaking, of growth, new program of growth in Europe, some signals came from Germany saying, very good, this is what we need. We need actually growth. We need program for growth. But just after this first declaration, the explanations came. What they want for more growth means deregulating the labor market. Deregulating the labor markets means actually to do what they did in Germany, which is to diminish, in particular, low wages, to cut on social costs. So when people speak of a program for growth, this type of program can have just any content, So, but this is certainly not the type of a left program, at least what people from the left would expect in France. So, program for growth would be more investment and so on. But of course, in the present situation, with a big deficit of the government, it's extremely difficult to have this type of policies. And yes.
So what are a few things that within the realm of what Hollande is and what kind of party that is, what are some things he actually could do that would be good for ordinary people of France?
But you know, I want to return to Germany because I really believe that now the important issue in Europe is that we are entering into another new stage of the crisis, of the present crisis. In various countries, like in Spain or in Greece, the recession is the new recession is already there. And the last figures that we have for Germany, for example, show that the German economy that everybody was considering, the best economy in Europe, actually is not yet in recession. But, now the economy begins to stagnate. And given the figures, it's very possible, if not likely, that they will enter into a new recession. And this will be the important factor, beyond the personality of a president or a government. This will be the crucial fact for the coming months and the coming years. If Europe enter into a new recession, they will have to stop with the policy that they are now following. They will have to stop with austerity, because recession will even, increase the deficits. And so, in this case, they will have to try to be innovative, but innovative will be extremely difficult.
But the austerity policies in the what they're calling the periphery countries of Europe, and even the bigger countries, Spain and Italy, I mean, those policies undermined German exports, didn't they? That was their big export market, was the rest of Europe. So, I mean, you would think these austerity policies Germany's pushing have to lead to some kind of slowdown in Germany.
Well, you see, all the countries in Europe are interdependent. That's obvious, okay? But I think that if you take the present government, Angela Merkel's in Germany, their view is actually to use the conditions created by the present crisis to try to obtain more, okay? And maybe, this will diminish a bit the export of Germany in the rest of Europe, but you have also the rest of the world. And of course, Germany is also exporting a lot, in countries like China and many other countries. So the problem is that maybe, I was speaking of recession in Europe, but maybe the recession, which is beginning now, will be a global recession. I don't know when it might reach Asia or Latin America. So you see, the situation in the United States maybe is a little different, because we just had the election in France, and in the US you will have the election in the future. The European Central Bank is certainly less committed, to the financing of the governments than in the United States. So in this respect, the situation is different. But the main, the crucial point is what will happen with the global crisis, or at least the crisis of the United States and Europe that we are having now. Okay, this is really the crucial issue. If we enter in this new phase, which seems in Europe to be more and more likely, and in my opinion will come also in the United States about 6 months later, then they will have to change. Because what's happening now is that actually in Europe, as in the United States, they are not changing the rules. They are changing the rules of nothing. The only thing that they did was they have deficit, okay, and the deficit support to a certain extent the macroeconomy. But, if we enter in a new recession, then they will have really to worry about actual solutions. An actual solution means regulating financial mechanism, means maybe a certain degree of protectionism, although it will be extremely difficult given the present situation. Well, it's hard to imagine what they could do, because, you see, this new phase of the crisis would be really something, it's even difficult to imagine what they could do, but they will be forced to do something.
So what you're saying is Germany is okay with deep recession in Greece and Spain and such, but if it hits Germany, then they got to switch their austerity course.
and also, there is a very strong ideological, I would say, or political aspect to the issue. Because if you read French newspaper, for example, you will read every day, that Germany is the example we should follow, okay? If we could do like Germany did, we would be okay, okay? And it's true that Germany has an important surplus of its foreign trade, and this is one advantage, but the German economy is not growing faster than the French economy. And the recession in Germany was much deeper than in France, for example, and just compare the two countries. So you see, there is an important ideological propaganda aspect, because now they keep telling us we should imitate Germany. This means cutting low wages, diminishing social protection, and what they call the flexibility of the labor market. So if now Germany, the German model, enters into difficulties, well, they will have to change a little bit the discourse, and it will be politically extremely important.
Now, Hollande, partly because of his speech that he's against austerity, and he even in his speeches, called on Europe to change course, and his new presidency is sort of a sign of a new stage against austerity measures. To what extent is this, just campaign rhetoric? Or, I mean, some people are suggesting he's kind of an Obama, a change you can believe in until you get elected. And then, in fact, what he's going to do is manage the crisis and maybe even diffuse some of the mass opposition to these policies.
During the campaign, both candidates, Hollande and Sarkozy, had to, in a certain sense, follow the discourse or the recommendation of, on the one hand, the extreme, more extreme, more radical, let's say, left, or the more radical right. And so Sarkozy was imitating completely, following all the arguments, of Marine Le Pen, and to be elected, and Hollande had to follow, to a certain extent, the recommendations of Mélenchon, okay?
On the left, yeah.
Yeah, on the left, you see. But when Hollande say, okay, we have to finish with austerity, certainly we have to stop austerity. If you read your economist, I'm speaking of the Nobel Prize, the Keynesian Nobel Prize that you had, they say, that the austerity policy of Europe is suicidal, okay? And it's certainly true. And it will be exactly the same thing, I believe, in the United States very soon, okay? So, but now, let's stop with austerity. What does it mean? Shall we increase deficits? Okay. So in this case, the debt will rise, and this is exactly what is happening. This is a problem. You treat a structural crisis with deficit, but the problem of a structural crisis is that it lasts 1 year, 3 years, now 4 years, okay? So the debt of the government is increasing. Who is going to pay for the debt? China, probably no longer, okay? So now you move to the United States, which is a central bank which is paying, okay? In Europe, the central bank has been paying, but actually very slowly, very slowly. So what will happen probably, is that to say, if we enter into a new recession, the central bank, the European Central Bank, will have to step in, and pay more and more of this deficit. If not, I don't see any other type of solution. But right now, in country with 5 or 10% of deficit of the government, the idea of really, spending more, it's obviously a problem. It's obviously a problem because it will not solve the present crisis. Solving the present crisis is much more structural problem. You see, for example, in a country like France, since 2004 about, French transnational corporations now are exactly following the type of course which that you have in the United States, which is that they are more and more investing in direct investment outside of the country. Okay, and this is the difference between France and Germany. But France is exactly following the US example. How can you restore the activity in a country which is in a big crisis when transnational French transnational corporation or US transnational corporation are every year increasing more and more their investment in the rest of the world? Okay, this is obviously impossible. But how can you stop transnational corporation doing that? by some kind of fiscal policy giving advantages in terms of taxes and so on. But taxes are absolutely necessary now because we are having very big deficit. You see, the problem is really that, as in the title of our book, this crisis is the crisis of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a monstrosity. It is completely unsustainable social order. So what we need is a very deep political transformation. But you know, neoliberalism is here in the world. It has been here during the last 30 years. All the economy of the world organize themselves gradually, you know, according to the rules of neoliberalism, in the periphery, in the center. Corporations are now managed according to the rules of neoliberalism. And I explain, you know, they go and they export their capital where they believe it's better, it's cheaper to produce, okay? So, you see, it's people in newspapers, they speak of deficit, they speak of austerity. But the fundamental problems, you know, is that we are in what we call a social order, which is unsustainable. But to change that, you need a very deep transformation.
Which means a big mass movement.
Well, I mean, the big mass movement would be maybe the political force which could lead to such a transformation. But you know what happened during the Great Depression in the United States, okay? And so at some point, you know, we will need some type of New Deal, you know, in a sense. But if you're reading the French Le Monde, the French newspaper, yesterday evening, in the front page, they have the word, you know, New Deal, okay? But it's just a joke now. It's just completely a joke, okay? And so, you see, this type of situation already occurred in history. And what we need is actually a very deep change. But for the crisis was already a shock. Of course, you know, more social struggle would be extremely important. But look at the result of the elections in France, okay? 52%. 52%. In a situation like the present situation, this is just ridiculous, you know. 52%. 48% of French people voted for Sarkozy. How can you do that? Okay. But
well, it's a similar situation in the United States. As you know, as critical as one can be of Obama, it boggles the mind that he's running neck and neck with Romney.
Yeah, that's exactly the situation everywhere, you know. So people like it. But you see, of course, you know, the propaganda is extremely important. And here we move to the discourse of the extreme right, you know. The extreme right, see, all these immigrants, they come here, you know, they take your jobs, you know, and they spend the money of our social system, which is health insurance and everything, okay? And they have their kids in school. And the school kids are bad, so they don't even study, you see. And so this discourse, this propaganda of the right, that Sarkozy took actually this discourse and repeated this discourse everywhere, okay, with extremely a degree of xenophobia, you know. So of course, you know, the link between this type of the social aspect of the campaign and the economic aspect of the campaign is very strong. So we need more, you know, the crisis was not enough. We need more of a crisis to maybe have some change, but we know also from history, and I was referring to the Great Depression, but you know what happened in Europe, okay? We had the Nazi and everything. So it's not because you have a crisis, because people are suffering, that you necessarily have a left alternative. You can have also an alternative to the right, and this is what happened in France, because actually Marine Le Pen was doing much better than Mélenchon.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, Gerard.
Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.